Who is chair of the International Development Select Committee. Good morning to you. We're hearing their international condemnation. Israel says that the strike was not carried out with an intention of harming. They say it was a mistake. It shouldn't have happened, and they are sorry. Is that enough?
No, it's really not enough, and they're absolutely right. It shouldn't have happened. And one of the reasons it shouldn't have happened is because, you know, they are one of the most advanced arms countries in the world. They're using very sophisticated technology. All the drones that we're seeing flying around, they're gathering data that's feeding into the AI, that's helping them make the decisions about where to strike. But most importantly, the thing that is really wicked about this is all of the aid organisations are giving very, very detailed information about where they are, what their movements are going to be, what they're going to be doing, who the personnel are, where their buildings are, and yet still we're seeing these strikes happening. It's just not good enough. And I was actually out on the Rafah border about 6 weeks ago with my committee, and we were speaking to UN security people there, and they were saying it's not that Israel is deliberately targeting aid workers, but in their opinion, they weren't doing enough to protect them. And that's appalling. And this is the outcome that we're seeing.
Yes, and we should be clear as well, since this war began on October the 7th, 196 aid workers have been killed. These just the latest 7, and among them, those 3 Britons. What happens next? We've heard time and time again international condemnation from leaders around the world about what is going on between Israel and Gaza, and yet it seems that very little on the ground changes.
Well, the condemnation has been rather soft, hasn't it? You know, it's sort of a slap on the wrist, and the fact that Cameron brought the Israeli ambassador in a couple of days yesterday, I mean, it's sort of going in front of the headmaster. What I would have wanted to see 6 months ago is the level of outrage that we're seeing, because, you know, nearly 200 Palestinian aid workers have been killed so far. We're looking at 1.7 million people who are facing starvation now. They're internally displaced. We're looking at all the infrastructure in Gaza being destroyed, and 6 months on, we're still just reprimanding people. I think what we need to see, though, the reality is that the UK and the US are the main sort of power holders in this situation. One of the reasons is that we are supplying arms. I mean, the US in a much bigger capacity than us. So where is the reassurance that those arms aren't being used against civilians? Apparently, Cameron had information from lawyers about breaches, whether there were breaches of international law nearly a month ago. So why is it that Parliament hasn't been given that information so that we can see if we are in breach of international law by continuing to supply arms? We're in a very difficult position here, and it's one that the government could get us out of by giving the information that we need to know.
Yes, and the consequence of these latest strikes, of course, is that the very people who need aid are now even less likely to get it. World Central Kitchen saying they've been forced to suspend their operations. We spoke to UNICEF a little earlier on the programme. They say they will continue for now. But the reality is, and you saw this for yourself when you visited Rafah, those 6 weeks ago, these people there desperately need this help, and it is increasingly difficult for aid workers to be able to get it to the people who need it.
Well, it's basically impossible. I mean, I'm incredibly grateful that the World Central Kitchen was able to get some aid in, and I'm grateful that we're airdropping aid in. But what we actually need to see is all of the border crossings open. There's only one now. It's Israel's gift to open them or not. And what we need is, you know, aid to literally flood in. I mean, before the horror of October the 7th, we were seeing about 500 trucks a day going in, and that was when all the warehouses were already full of food, when people's store cupboards were full of food, and when when Gaza was growing its own food, and it was self-sufficient in chickens, for example. Now that there's nothing, all the cupboards, all the stores are bare.
And sorry to interrupt, but what needs to change to allow that to happen? We keep talking about aid needing to flood in. We've been discussing it for weeks, even before these latest strikes. What needs to change?
It's very simple. Israel needs to relax the bureaucracy. It needs to open all of the land gates, because only one at the moment is open, to let the aid flood in. People are facing famine. Children, all children under 5 now are predicted to be malnourished to a point of stunting. So that's the rest of their future gone. What we need is not just the food to get in, but we need the medicine to get in. You know, when we took evidence 2 months ago, we were talking about 450,000 people with air and waterborne diseases. They all need support. There's all the people just like us who have long-term conditions, you know, whether that's cancer or heart conditions, who haven't had treatment at all. I mean, I saw a 3-year-old in Bridge Hospital, and she was diagnosed with leukemia at a couple of months old. She hasn't had any treatment for the last 5 months. She's going to die, and these deaths are entirely preventable. This famine is 100% man-made, and Israel needs to relax the red tape. I understand why it's so incredibly nervous, but people are dying, and it has a duty as an occupying state to those people to provide food, and that's just not happening, and they've made it a lot harder right now.
Sarah Champion, grateful for your time this morning. Thank you, Chair of the International Development Committee for April. 3 British aid workers who died in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza have been named. John Chapman, James Henderson and James Kirby were among 7 who were killed.
The men were part of a security team working for the charity World Central Kitchen. There has been international condemnation of the strike, with Israel saying it was unintended. Graham Satchell reports.
The pictures tell their own devastating story. The team from the charity World Central Kitchen was travelling in a convoy of 3 cars. You can clearly see their logo. Each car was hit in what looks like a precision targeted attack. The charity has now paid tribute to the 7 workers who lost their lives, including 3 British nationals. 57-year-old John Chapman, who's believed to have served in the Royal Marines, was working for the charity as a security advisor. James Henderson, who was 33, is also understood to have served in the Marines. James Kirby was 47 and another armed forces veteran. All 3 men were trying to protect their colleagues. The charity described them as heroes. These 7 beautiful souls were killed by the Israel Defense Forces. Their smiles, laughter and voices are forever embedded in our memories. We are reeling from our loss, the world's loss. World Central Kitchen was providing vital food aid in Gaza, supplying millions of meals. The consequences of the attack will be felt here first. The charity has paused its operations, putting immediate stress on an already desperate situation.
That's going to put civilians at risk, at greater risk of famine. People are already starving to death. And what we really need now is for aid to get in quickly and to be able to be distributed safely.
Nathaniel is in Jerusalem. She told us what impact it could have on aid deliveries into Gaza.
I mean, there's no doubt about it. This is a major setback, and of course we've already had the UN warning repeatedly in recent weeks about the threat of famine looming in Gaza. Now, World Central Kitchen, late last month, it said it had 67 kitchens operating in Gaza, that it was feeding 350,000 people every day. It was also, of course, operating this maritime route, bringing in food supplies from Cyprus directly into the north of Gaza. Now, the aid workers had just unloaded 100 tons of that aid from one barge in the latest flotilla to arrive when they were killed in this Israeli airstrike. Now, the remaining 240 tons of food that was just off the coast of Gaza, so tantalisingly close, that has had to make its way back to Cyprus, because at the moment there is no way to offload the rest of that food that was on the ships. I mean, this has really just exacerbated a long-time debate
well, that's what Israel wanted, I would imagine.
Gaza,
that's
where
probably
Israel says it
was the
doesn't limit
plan.
aid. Aid workers are saying that they have real difficulties with access and with distribution.
And they've
so
achieved a great success there, haven't they? The idea.
To be put in place to guarantee the safety of their staff before they're allowed to go back and operate as they have been.
Sheila now there in
done by not only Palestinians but also by international organizations and the international community, calling to afford more security and to allow for more land crossings on the ground here inside Gaza in order to allow for further flow of humanitarian supplies to the desperate Palestinians who have been not receiving the latest convoy being delivered from Cyprus, and it had been again returned back to the port of Cyprus in order to completely be banned from distributing because of the latest attack that had killed 7-8 workers. The majority of them were foreign nationals.
Tariq, thank you very much for the update. That's Al Jazeera's Tariq Abu-Azzoum live there in Rafah. Well, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has condemned the attack on the aid workers.
The devastating Israeli airstrikes that killed World Central Kitchen personnel yesterday bring the number of aid workers killed in this conflict to 196, including more than 175 members of our own UN staff. This is unconscionable, but it is an inevitable result of the way the war is being conducted. It demonstrates yet again the urgent need for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, the unconditional release of all hostages, and the expansion of humanitarian aid into Gaza, as the Security Council demanded in its resolution last week. The resolution must be implemented without delay.
This is a tragedy. We still don't understand how this could have happened. I would like to express my sincere condolences to the family of our brave volunteer. I spoke in person to the ambassador of Israel, who assured me that this case will be urgently explained and that Poland will receive a full range of information.
I spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu this morning.
All these people who support him.
A phone call that was organised overnight. I expressed Australia's anger and concern at the death of Zomi Francom. Zomi was an Australian aid worker working for the World Central Kitchen, providing support for people who are suffering from tremendous deprivation in Gaza.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has admitted his forces launched the strike that killed the aid workers, but says it was unintentional.
Yeah, right. It looked unintentional.
Unfortunately, last day there was a tragic incident of an unintended strike of our forces.
Yeah, straight through the centre of all the roofs.
This happens in war. We are checking this thoroughly. We are in touch with the governments and we will do everything for this not to happen.
No one believes you.
But an Al Jazeera investigation has found that the Israeli army intentionally targeted the World Central Kitchen convoy in 3 consecutive airstrikes. Here's what the evidence shows. The organization says its 3 vehicles left the warehouse here in Deir al-Balah sometime around 10:30 p.m. on April 1st. The convoy traveled just over 4 kilometers, making it to Rashid Street along the coast. Witnesses say the first vehicle was hit by a missile here just before 10:45 p.m. The injured were seen being transferred from the first car to the second armored vehicle. The second car made it 800 meters south from the first attack when it too was bombed. Jesus. Photos clearly show it was hit straight through the roof by a projectile from above. The third vehicle in the convoy made it a further 1,600 meters down the road before it was hit by a third and final strike, also through its roof. Let's bring in Al Jazeera's Imran Khan in occupied East Jerusalem. Imran, Netanyahu says these things happen in war, but our investigation and others show this wasn't perhaps an accident. What are the reactions there?
Well, there's been very little reaction to the allegations that this was a deliberate attack. Like you say, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the entire Israeli establishment saying, actually, these things just happen in war. It was a tragic accident and we are investigating. But there is a brewing controversy here about how this actually happened. When there's a drone strike, when there's a military strike, you have a clear command and control structure. Someone in the command center, a senior military person needs to sign off on any strike that happens on vehicles. This is just standard practice. The Israelis have been very proud, saying that we know exactly what they're doing. They also say that they were in touch with the World Central Kitchen. So this talk of it being an accident, something that just happens in war, is not something that most military analysts that we've been speaking to, most people who look at these things very, very carefully, are suggesting didn't happen in the way it should have done. There was a clear either failure of that command and control structure, or it was deliberate, and that's what people are discussing right now. Was this a deliberate strike?
Right, and this, sadly, is not the first attack on humanitarian workers in Gaza. Many Palestinian aid workers have been killed. Are we likely to see Imran a proper investigation and proper accountability in this case, as foreign workers were the victims here?
Well, if you speak to the Americans, you speak to the British, the Canadians, the Poles and the Australians who have been involved in this as their citizens, they are really pushing that narrative. They want a clear investigation and they want to know how this actually happened. But nobody says that when it comes to the Palestinian aid workers that have been killed. Remember, UNRWA, although it's a United Nations agency, relies on Palestinians to be able to do the work. They can't bring in workers from outside in large numbers, so they have to rely on Palestinians. At least 110 of those Palestinians have been killed since October the 7th, working for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, alone. Those deaths have not been investigated in any kind of the way that this one is being investigated. However, will we, the public, will we, the media, see the results of that investigation, or will the Israelis say to the countries involved, we're going to give you the results, but you can't make them public? We've seen that in previous investigations over the years that the Israelis have done. They give it to the governments, and the governments say, we've got the investigation, we draw a line underneath it. This, however, is a lot more public than those, so let's see where the Israelis land on this. But certainly, because this is foreign nationals, it is being investigated. There is a highlight on it. But those Palestinians, those Palestinian aid workers that have been killed, no one is asking questions about what happened to them.
Imran, thank you very much for that. That's Imran Khan live there in occupied East Jerusalem. Well, as Imran mentioned, and for the findings to be made public. Alan Fisher has more on this from Washington.
Well, President Biden says he spoke to Jose Andres, the founder of the World Central Kitchen, called him his friend and said he expressed his condolences at the death of the
sending
workers
billions
in Gaza.
of pounds
He
worth of bombs then, Biden. No one, words are
not
cheap.
directly at Israel, not explicitly at Israel because of the attack, but we'll strip it back so you can understand the context here. He says, I'm outraged and heartbroken by the deaths of 7 humanitarian workers,
You're sending
including
the
one
bombs
America
for
in
it.
Gaza. They were providing food to hungry civilians in the middle of the war.
Yeah,
they were
you
brave
don't
and
say.
selfless. Their
Unlike
deaths
you.
are a tragedy.
Unlike
He
you,
then says
supporting
Israel
it.
has pledged to conduct a thorough investigation into why the aid workers' vehicle were hit by airstrikes. That investigation must be, in his words, swift. It must bring accountability, and its findings must be made public.
Yeah, well, words are cheap.
We've seen Israel
See
carry
what
out
he actually does.
investigations in similar sort of incidents. We at Al Jazeera had a similar situation when the Israelis promised a full and transparent investigation into the killing of our colleague Shireen Abu Akleh in Jenin 2 years ago. And at that point, the Israelis admitted that they were responsible, but then said that no one would be held accountable for that. This is something that Joe Biden is clearly trying to avoid. Even more tragically, adds Joe Biden in his statement, this is not a standalone incident. This conflict has been one of the worst in recent memory in terms of how many aid workers have been killed. Of course, UNRWA has suffered numerous deaths in Gaza during the war, and there has been no statement of this strength from the White House.
Well, to discuss this and the latest developments in Israel's war on Gaza, let's bring in Omar Ashur, Professor of Security and Military Studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Thank you for joining us, Omar. Let's talk about this attack and the intention, because there was an interesting article in Haaretz newspaper which said that some Israeli military leaders have blamed the killing of these 7 aid workers on, quote, a lack of discipline on the part of commanders in the field. What are your thoughts about this? Are we
They
in a
have been
situation
shooting children
here
in the head.
Israeli
There's evidence
soldiers
of
in
that.
Gaza basically set
From
the rules
doctors.
themselves?
Loads of them.
So let's establish first the facts, because there were 3 strikes on 3 cars.
Right, as our investigation has shown. Right?
Yes,
Yeah.
and the second one has clearly, there was some communication after the second strike. So there is an intentional issue there. The missiles that are fired are expensive missiles. If it's a spike from an Hermes 450, that's about $200,000 a pop, a missile.
Right.
If it's something lower, like a variant of the Hellfire, it's about $150,000 a missile as well. So it needs some command level. But there's a big but here. The Israeli army has been fighting since probably its establishment since 48 onwards in a relatively decentralized way, and that's why the tactical aggression is very high. What we call in the NATO armies mission command. So they devolve the junior officers to take quick decisions on the battlefield without going back to the senior ones. And this is what made somebody like Ariel Sharon, for example, a decorated general as opposed to a court-martialed officer in any other army. So they allow this, and that took it actually interestingly from the Germans, from the Wehrmacht, the German army, who had the concept of Auftragstaktik, which is also mission-type tactics. So they devolved to the juniors to take quick decisions.
So just to
So they
clarify
can
for us,
actually pass the
it's
blame
not
on to
necessarily a
them.
lack of discipline, but the way the system is set up, where junior commanders in the field in Gaza
So
will make
to
these
protect
decisions on their
all
own
those
without
people
a higher command giving the green
who
light.
have been
Yes,
doing
it is
the
an
most
Israeli
awful
way
war
of warfare,
crimes.
and it has been established, and they learned this from the Germans, and it's been going on for a very long time, and it led to tactical aggression, multiple victories because they're quicker than the enemies, was usually rigid, centralized, but more accurate.
But no
But
accountability
it
at
leads
all.
also to a lot of deaths among civilians. We saw over 30,000 in Gaza, but also deaths of hostages as well, because you saw the
Israeli hostages were
Israeli
killed.
hostages were killed.
Yeah.
They also lead to in Gaza so far. That's one of the highest rates of deaths by friendly fire. So 1 in every 5 Israeli soldiers were killed by his own colleague, not by the adversary's forces. So in a way, this trigger happy leads to tactical aggression, but also leads to a lot of deaths. So it could be, this is just one scenario, because we need more investigations to understand what really happened. But it could be one of some of the junior officers taking quick decisions or ignoring any signals and
Don't believe
communications
that.
that happened, especially after the first strike.
Now, interesting. Let's talk about the motivations then behind this latest Israeli criminal action, because that's what it is, right? The UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, has said she believes Israel intentionally killed these aid
Absolutely.
workers
It's
to scare
obvious.
humanitarian
It's worked,
relief
hasn't it?
donors and to ensure the continued starvation of
Absolutely.
Palestinians
That's
in
the
Gaza.
obvious
What,
thing.
what do you think the motivation is
It's
here
clear.
by targeting these aid workers and
Absolutely
other
clear.
Palestinian
It's
humanitarian
worked.
workers as well, as we've heard?
It's very difficult to establish motivation, but
It's not
you can. It's a scenario, right? But the problem with scenarios is they cannot prove them or disprove them until further investigation is being conducted. But there
obvious.
is
Direct
also the basic
3
military idea of
separate
what we
times.
call strategic bombardment.
That's
So
what we've
basically
done.
create, and the Israelis have what they call the Dahya Doctrine, which basically punish the civilians from the areas where attack has come from or rockets were fired, and therefore create more and more hostile environment for any anti-Israeli
It's
attack.
so highly
And therefore
populated,
destroy the
that just
infrastructure. And
means
this
they're
can
going to
fit
kill all
into
the people.
That if you extend it a bit or
There's no special
pushed it a bit
military
further,
area
it
in
can lead to
Gaza,
attacks,
it's so
on
small.
aid workers.
Hamas
But again,
can't get away from
we're
the
still in the
people.
early stages. What we know so far is this was intentional.
Right.
This is not an accident.
There
This is
wasn't
a
an accident,
mistake.
it was yeah.
It's not an accident.
Right.
And some, I don't know, junior or senior officer have taken this decision to strike 3 aid cars with 3 missiles, and after a communication that apparently happened after the first strike.
All right, we've heard condemnation from around the world, from Joe Biden as well. Do you believe that any of Israel's allies, like the US, will exert more pressure now and real pressure on Israel?
Well,
after
they're
this
already
incident?
trying to make excuses.
Define pressure. There is condemnation for a while now. There are even
Exactly.
withholding of the veto in the Security Council. But then the real pressure will have to turn into stopping the ammunitions and weapons, which actually we know that just a couple of days ago the Washington Post reported on a new batch of
completely destroyed Al-Shifa Hospital
after withholding the veto. So it was if you real pressure means real actions and policies to withhold that military campaign. And so far, this is unclear to me that it is happening.
Thank you so much, Omar, for joining us. Omar Al-Shur from the Doha Institute of Graduate Studies on Al Jazeera.
But it's not an accident.
Right.
And some 8 cars with 3 missiles